In this tutorial, we wanted to share some ideas for working through the rest of the material. You can continue through the rest of Module 1 tutorials in some of these ways. You can read the tutorial notes in the downloadable PDF files as you listen to the audio, or obviously watch these tutorial videos. You can read and think through the discussion questions and talk about these questions with your group leader or program facilitator. You could take notes on your thoughts or write out a longer answer if you choose to. And you can do the activities and assignments. You'll find these at the end of each tutorial in the notes. And then submit any written material to your program facilitator if that's how you're choosing to use the material. Let's talk briefly about the discussion points and why we have them. The discussion points can be used as a basis for discussion with other people during your times together, or just for you to think through on your own. The discussion points in the Biblical Foundation tutorials were developed with some of these things in mind. We wanted to help you engage with the truth in such a way that your own worldview assumptions are held up, as it were, to the light of God's Word. This is done chronologically or sequentially, in other words, following the narrative of God's own story, and foundationally. In other words, each layer of truth being added only after the previous, more basic strata are solidly in place. The discussion points are intended to help in the process by prompting you to consider the influences and building blocks that have shaped your own worldview, and those are the culture you are most familiar with, as you engage with the narrative of God's Word. Some of the suggested discussion points are more theoretical and objective about what people out there think and say. Others, as we've already mentioned, are more about your own preconceptions and worldview assumptions. Some are more subjective and touch on our emotional or personal responses to the truth about God. We wanted the discussions to cover the whole scope of these different areas. Discussions in many Bible studies, I think you'll agree, can quickly lose focus and therefore their effectiveness. These discussion points in this Access Truth material are intended to help generate discussion while keeping it relevant and clearly connected to the material that's covered in the tutorial itself. Engaging with these questions should help you to become familiar with this kind of discussion so you are equipped yourself to encourage discussion that is relevant to the foundational truths that a passage of God's Word is bringing out. Although the purpose of these discussion points is to raise questions and issues which are not directly covered in the tutorials themselves, they are still, as has been stated, very much related to the part of God's Word being covered. So in that sense, just like the tutorials themselves, any ensuing discussion should also be foundational. In other words, even though we assume that you are believers and may be very familiar with the Bible, the discussions will be most effective if you engage with the layer of truth being covered at that point, rather than moving on or jumping to another place in the Bible. So any application to your life should be made as much as possible in light of whatever truth has already been covered up to that point. Again, this models and therefore equips you to have fruitful discussions with other people without jumping prematurely to truth for which no foundations have yet been laid. And that is a key principle of foundational teaching, because it gives the authority to God's Word itself rather than to the thoughts or opinions of a teacher or another person. It guides people to develop the habit of basing their answers and their thinking on the foundational truths of God's Word that have already been clearly established. So here's a key principle to apply. As you answer the questions or guide a group discussion, for example, try to remember to keep as the basis for answers only the truths that have been presented from God's Word in previous tutorials. In other words, from His Word itself. Why is this so important? Well, imagine, if you can, sharing with a person or a group who have only ever heard the amount of truth presented from the Bible up to the point you are at in the narrative presentation. They don't have access to the rest of the Bible or other Bible commentaries or resources. Maybe because they're just simply not available, as is the case in many places in the world, or maybe because they've just never engaged with God's Word before. So they're hearing the truth as it's revealed gradually in God's Word and are therefore building a strong foundation of truth based on truth itself, not on your opinion or anyone else's. Even those who have heard some of God's Word but don't understand the real meaning or significance or the way it ties together will benefit from having the authority of it reinforced in this way. And we trust that this exercise, this discipline, will also bring more clarity and strength in your own faith as you see God's Word providing the answers and the foundations of truth that are being established.